This is the video where you learn everything you need to know about your iPhone camera. Since the iPhone revolutionized photography 15 years ago, many new and powerful features have been added. There's things like multiple cameras, 4K recording, Dolby Vision, Apple ProRes, cinematic mode, and much more. This is a photo and video studio in your pocket. Maybe you've just switched to iPhone, or maybe you've had one for a while and you haven't yet fully got to grips with it. Either way, this video is for you because I'm going to take you from the very basics of using the iPhone cameras to more advanced methods. But let's start at the beginning, the iPhone camera app.
When you open your iPhone for the first time, you'll find these two apps together, the Photos app and the Camera app. The Photos app, with these petals of colors like a flower, is where you will find not just photos you've taken, but videos as well. I'll come to the Photos app later because there's some important settings that make sure the app isn't over compressing your media. But first, let's look at the Camera app. The Camera app has this image of a regular camera. Tap it to open the camera. The screen of your phone is now taken over mostly by the view from the camera. Around the edge, you have the settings controls and of course the big circle, which is the shutter button. When the camera is in photo mode, this button is white. But when you switch to video mode, this button goes red. So that's a quick way to know whether you are in photo or video mode. In photo mode, tap this button to take a picture. In video mode, tap this button to start recording. The red circle turns into a smaller red square, and now the counter tells you how long you've been recording. Tap the button again and it will stop recording. Whether you capture a photo or a video clip, it will now be stored in the media gallery. The media gallery is the square beside the record button. And you'll see the thumbnail here change after you captured some new media. If you tap this, it opens up the gallery, which is in fact the Photos app, which I mentioned earlier. So this square button is like a shortcut from the Camera app to the Photos app. But to quickly return to the Camera app, just click the small arrow in the corner here. If you want to delete media, open it in the photo gallery and just tap the trash can button. But what if you accidentally deleted a photo or video and you actually wanted to keep it? Well, don't worry, because when you delete media, your iPhone just removes it from the gallery and it stores it somewhere else, ready for deleting at a later date. So to restore this media, open the Photos app, click Albums, so then scroll to and click Recently Deleted. Tap Select and select all the media that you want to put back. And then finally, just tap Recover. Now, if we go back to the Camera app, on the other side of the shutter button is this circular arrows icon. And if you tap this, you can switch between rear and front facing cameras.
Now there's various ways that you can set up your iPhone's camera app, but we're going to look at that more later. First, let's look at the different cameras that come with your iPhone.
All iPhones now have at least two cameras. So whichever model you own, you will have at least one camera on the back of your phone, called the rear camera or cameras, and one on the front, the same side as the screen. This camera is often called the selfie camera. A selfie, as you probably already know, is a photo or a video that you capture yourself of yourself and any friends or family that you have around you. Depending on your iPhone, you will have 1, 2, or 3 rear cameras. So for example, a basic iPhone 12 or 13 has 2 rear cameras, while the 12 and 13 Pro or Pro Max have 3 rear cameras. If your iPhone has 2 rear cameras, one is going to be the regular wide lens, while the other is going to be the ultra wide lens. If your iPhone has 3 cameras, this extra camera is the telephoto camera. So in recent iPhones, all cameras have sensors with 12 megapixels, and that's the front and rear cameras wide to telephoto.
The cameras on your iPhone provide you with a range of options when it comes to capturing photos or videos.
So if you're capturing video for a project which uses a number of clips edited together, then it's a good idea to make use of all the rear cameras available to you. When you come to edit your video, using different looking shots enhances the overall feel of the finished work. The main rear camera, which is really the default camera, has the best sensor and generally performs better, especially in low light. As well, the larger aperture and bigger sensor mean that this camera has the shallowest depth of field. In practice, that means the background is a little bit more blurred compared to the other cameras. The main camera has a good balance in terms of field of view, and you'll find that the main camera's biggest sensor performs the best out of all the cameras in your iPhone, as well as its superior inbuilt stabilization. The ultra-wide camera gives you an even wider field of view. For example, the iPhone 12 and 13 range of phones have an ultra-wide camera with a 120-degree field of view. And by comparison, a GoPro Hero 10, for example, has a maximum field of view of 148 degrees. Using the ultra-wide for photos or videos can make those images stand out. Put simply, the ultra-wide makes things look a bit different. This wide angle can make things look more epic. Landscape views can look more magnificent. Buildings can look more impressive.
Normally, the physics of lenses dictates that the wider a lens is, the less camera shake is going to be observable. And often you're going to get advice saying that the ultra-wide lens on your iPhone creates smoother video. But is this actually true? Well, in fact, when using an iPhone 12, 13 or later model, this isn't really true.
And this is because the main sensor has amazing stabilization that the ultra-wide sensor doesn't. So here's a test I made walking along as steady as I could, and you can see that when I switch to the main sensor, the video does become a bit more stable. Now, if you have an iPhone 13 model or later, the ultra-wide camera is also a macro camera, and this allows you to capture video and photos very, very close up. The telephoto camera is kind of like the opposite of the ultra-wide camera. It narrows the field of view. At the same time, it zooms in closer to the subject of the image that you're capturing. The telephoto cameras allow you to zoom in optically, which usually creates a higher quality image than zooming in digitally. For example, the iPhone 13 Pro telephoto lens gives you a 3 times optical magnification, which means the camera will show objects 3 times the size when compared to the main camera. When you're editing a video, close-up shots really add value to your final work. Just like in life, if we find something interesting, we want to take a closer look. So use the tele lens to pick out certain details that you want to show your audience. The main disadvantage with the tele lens is that it exaggerates camera movement. Therefore, any camera shakes are going to be more obvious when using the tele lens.
But to minimize the shaky camera as much as possible, we can actually use a more stable grip. So the problem with shooting with a smartphone compared to other cameras is that they do wobble a lot, especially this way. So if you're holding it at each end here, quite often when you're moving around, you're going to get this sort of wobbliness. So if you try to hold the smartphone with your left hand normal and your right hand flat against the back, and now this is much more secure, it's much less likely to wobble around, and you can get much more stable shots. So let's go back to the camera app and look at some of the most important controls.
And depending on your device, this screen can look a little bit different, but the essential controls should be the same. Beside the shutter button is a menu of shooting modes, so you can just swipe left and right to select a mode, or just tap on the name of the mode. You can also swipe left and right on the middle of the screen. The most important modes are video and photo. Apple has cleverly put these in the middle because all the modes on the video side of the menu are video modes, while all the modes on the photo side are photo modes. This makes it a little bit easier to navigate the modes. Next to the modes menu is the lens selector. In the middle is the main camera labeled 1x, which is 1 times. Below is the ultra-wide camera, labeled 0.5 times. Above is the telephoto camera, in this case labeled 2.5 times because this is an iPhone 12 Pro Max. So just tap to switch between cameras. But if you tap and hold instead, you will get a zoom wheel. Now swipe up and down to zoom in and out smoothly. You can also change cameras while you're recording video, so you don't need to stop recording to zoom in and out this way. So you're going to notice that on the iPhone 12 Pro Max, you can actually zoom in beyond the 2.5 optical zoom. That's because once you go past the 2.5 times optical limit, the camera starts to zoom in digitally. But when you zoom in digitally, you do reduce the number of working pixels, which is why you start to see some nasty artifacts appearing in the image if you zoom too far. Personally, if I'm trying to capture high quality images, I actually never go beyond this 2.5 times optical zoom. So if you do nothing but hit the shutter button, the iPhone camera app is gonna set exposure and focus automatically. And if you're shooting a photo, auto mode usually does a pretty good job. But when you're shooting a video, you're more likely to need to control these settings to some degree. So when objects move within the frame during a shot, or when you move your iPhone, exposure will keep adjusting. And this can sometimes look a little bit messy, especially if you use longer takes. With short clips for a fast-paced montage, for example, you can usually get away with auto mode. To lock exposure and focus with the camera app, touch and hold on the screen until the yellow square makes this expanding and contracting movement. At the top, it now says AEAF lock. That's auto exposure and autofocus lock. The camera app uses the point where you touch the screen as a reference to set exposure and focus. So if I tap on the room, it will expose the room correctly. But if I tap on the window, which is brighter, it will set exposure and focus there instead. Once locked, the yellow square is now constantly visible. At the side of the square is a sun or a light symbol. So if you drag this up and down, you can now adjust the overall exposure. So now when I move the camera around, the exposure won't change.
Or will it? Well, actually, iPhones have a thing called dynamic tone mapping, which means that you can never fully lock exposure with an iPhone, unless you have a very old one. Recent iPhones have a reputation of producing dynamic range rivaling that from professional cameras. So how does Apple achieve this? The answer is that they use computational methods, and the main one is called dynamic tone remapping. Put simply, this process allows different exposure levels for different areas of the frame. So let me show you what I mean by using a smartphone with dynamic tone mapping switched off.
So in Pro mode on my Samsung, this process is completely disabled. If we look at this image, we can see the windows are much brighter than the rest of the room. So if I adjust exposure for the windows, the room gets very dark. And if I adjust the exposure for the room, the windows become overexposed. Now if I switch to the iPhone camera app and I tap on the window, they now become exposed properly. But the room is also pretty well exposed. And that's because the camera app is in effect setting exposure for the windows and the room differently. And it's because of this process and because Apple has decided that it cannot be switched off that you can never really fully lock exposure using a modern iPhone. And this means that exposure can continue to adjust even after locking in certain circumstances. So locking exposure does mostly remove exposure adjustments, but not completely. While you could just forget about it and let the camera app do the thinking, often you can do an even better job by helping it out a little bit. So if I just start recording now, the window will be blown out. But if I tap on the window first, we kind of prompt the app to start using tone remapping to fill in that window. And the room becomes a little bit darker, but to me this is a better looking image overall. When you lock exposure and you use the exposure adjustment slider by the yellow box, when you click away, that adjustment is now forgotten.
So if you want to keep this exposure adjustment, you can set it in a different way.
Swipe on the screen away from the shutter button a little and it opens an exposure adjustment button. A circle with a plus and a minus sign. Tap that and now use this slider to move the exposure up and down. In horizontal mode, we also have this little arrow which we can tap to open the exposure slider instead. So I'm going to adjust it down by 1 to -1, and now every video I record will have this -1 adjustment. And what that means is that the camera app will set exposure automatically, but it's going to adjust it down a bit. In the corner of the screen, there is now an exposure adjustment indicator, which tells you the current exposure setting.
Like every smartphone ever made, your iPhone can shoot vertical video as well as horizontal video.
As you most likely know, hold your phone horizontal or vertical, depending on what you want. And in the app, you're going to see some of the settings rotating as you do so. Now you might find that you wanted horizontal video, but it's come out vertical. Or maybe you wanted vertical video and it's come out horizontal. And that's because when you press record, your iPhone sticks to whatever mode it was in at the time. So when you open the video in the gallery, you might find that the video or the photo is now the wrong way round. But don't worry, because this is easy to fix. Just open the video, tap edit at the bottom, tap this cropping icon with 2 curved arrows, and now tap this icon at the top here. It's a square with an arrow, and you just keep tapping until the video is the way that you want it.
So when you're going to be editing video clips together and you want it to look polished and you want it to look professional, pretty much 2 of the most important settings are resolution and frame rate.
In the corner of the app, you can see the resolution and frame rate the app is currently set to. Right now, it is 24 frames per second and 4K resolution. So you can tap these to change them. And with this iPhone, I can go up to 4K at 60 frames per second.
And these days, I rarely ever shoot anything in a lower resolution than 4K. And even if you intend to output at a lower resolution, starting higher will mean that you end up with something better looking at the end. And this is all down to video compression, which is applied at various stages of shooting and editing and uploading a video to platforms such as YouTube. So put simply, quality gets eroded during this process. But if you start with more quality, you usually finish with more quality.
Go into camera settings and scroll down to find this setting called grid. Now if you toggle that on, go back to camera app, and now you will have 4 lines crossing the screen, vertical and horizontal. And these are guides which help you to compose a frame. And the thing is, in art and photography, there's this method of creating a composition called the rule of thirds. And this is related to something called the golden ratio. And that's what this grid is all about. So one way to use the grid is to use this middle box to center things. And this can be useful when shooting a hyperlapse, for example, or if you just want to make sure your frame is perfectly symmetrical. And another way to use the grid is to place important objects on the intersection of the lines. Swipe away from the shutter button to reveal a menu of buttons. And you can swipe along to reveal yet more buttons. The first button switches the flash between auto, on and off. The next button switches night mode on and allows you to set the amount of time the mode uses for each photo. Then the next button along switches live photo between auto, on or off. So a live photo is actually a very short video clip, and this allows you to choose the exact frame that you want later, as well as add other effects like a slow shutter effect, for example. And now the next button along allows you to choose the frame ratio. And then going along one more, this button allows you to adjust the exposure up and down, as we talked about before. And now the next button switches timer between off 3 seconds or 10 seconds. So just press the shutter and you get a delay before the camera takes a picture. Now going along one more button, this one allows you to add a preset color filter. And finally here, you can switch on or off RAW photos. And also, if you've enabled RAW photos in the settings, you will be able to toggle on and off RAW photos with this button here. So if you shot some video, and then when you open it in the Photos app, it looks amazing. But then when you go to edit the video, you suddenly find that the footage looks very different and kind of very wrong. So if you have a recent iPhone, any model since the iPhone 12, these devices now have the capability to shoot a format called Dolby Vision. And this format adds extra dynamic range to the video. But to view this format correctly, you need a monitor which supports it. And to edit this format correctly, you need to set your editing software's color space correctly.
And the problem is, for all iPhones since the 12 model, Apple has set this to the default setting. So if you just take your iPhone out of the box and start shooting video, you're going to be shooting Dolby Vision. So why have Apple done this when this format is not universally compatible? Well, my guess is that because it looks really amazing in your iPhone. And also any Apple product that was made since the iPhone 12 is going to be compatible with Dolby Vision.
For example, on my 2020 iPad, I can view Dolby Vision in all its glory. On my 2020 MacBook Air, I can also view Dolby Vision. And YouTube even supports Dolby Vision, Perhaps your TV supports it as well.
The problem is, if you want to show your video to the masses, there's a big question mark over whether they'll be viewing it wrongly and they're getting this overexposed look. And for this reason, most people are not yet shooting Dolby Vision with their iPhones, except perhaps by accident because it's the default setting.
So to turn this off, go into settings and then camera settings, record video, and then toggle off HDR video. So now that we're here, we may as well look at some other camera settings. In this same screen, at the top, we have all the resolution and frame rate combinations available. One thing you might notice here is that there are two different HD settings. One is 720 and the other is 1080. And that's because there are two official types of high definition video. So 720 HD is known as standard high definition, whereas 1080 HD is known as full high definition. Now, if you tap one of these combinations, you'll get a tick beside it. And this now becomes your default video setting. So when you open up your camera, it's automatically going to be set to this combination. Of course, you can just change this in the app as I showed you before. So I've set this to 4K and 24 frames per second because 24 frames per second is the standard frame rate for movies and dramas on TV. If professionals want that cinematic film look, they pretty much always shoot and play back at 24 frames per second. Now, when I'm shooting slow motion, I usually use the 60 frames per second option here, and then I'll play it back at 40% speed, which is 24 frames per second. And this way you can match your 24 frames per second video clips and your 60 frames per second clips which you want to slow down for slow motion. And below these settings is a little hint guide. Obviously there's a lot more to learn about frame rates and resolution than you've got here, and I talk about all this kind of stuff in my ebooks and my video lessons which are on Patreon for members if you want to go a bit deeper. Below that we have the Show PAL Formats setting. Put simply, if you toggle this on, you will now get a 25 frames per second option. Why might we want to shoot 25 frames per second? Well, 25 frames per second is the standard frame rate for TV in certain regions of the world. As you can see here, it says Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America. And the reason 25 frames per second is used in these regions is to do with strobing of artificial light. So if you notice that lights are flickering or strobing, you can try shooting at 25 frames per second.
Personally, even though I live in Europe, I don't usually shoot in 25 frames per second because frame rates of 24, 30 and 60 frames per second all fit together nicely when you're editing your video. Again, if you want to go deeper into this, join me on Patreon.
The setting below allows us to toggle on an auto frames per second feature. With this on, your video will be shot at 60 frames per second unless there is not enough light, in which case it will automatically switch to 30 frames per second.
So I'd actually call this a kind of home movie setting. It's good if you don't want to bother with all this stuff about frame rates, but personally I want to set frame rates myself because different frame rates have different quality. So when you're editing clips together, you might get a noticeable change in quality when you're mixing 30 and 60 frames per second.
So the final setting stops the camera switching lenses automatically. Again, this is kind of another home movie setting. If you're shooting video and your iPhone decides to switch lenses in the middle of a take, it doesn't look too good. It looks a bit unprofessional. And that's why I have this setting enabled.
Right, let's go out of the screen and look at some more important camera settings.
If we click on Formats, here we can choose between high efficiency and most compatible. The top option is the more advanced and is the latest version, which uses less storage space. But the downside is possible compatibility issues. There's no separate option for video and photo, so if you pick high efficiency, you're going to get H.265 codec videos and HEIF photos. But if you pick most compatible, you will get H.264 videos and JPEG photos. These days, I do have this set to high efficiency because I do have a fairly recent laptop to edit on with updated software, and I prefer the more economical use of storage. Note that if you have Dolby Vision, it actually has to use high efficiency. And lastly, you can toggle on Apple RAW photos. This format retains a much larger amount of color information, but it also does create bigger files. It's good if you want to work on the color of your photos later. If you have an iPhone 13 or later model, you will have the option to choose to shoot video in Apple ProRes. And this is a professional video format which preserves more detail and color information than the H.264 or H.265 formats normally used. So the big advantage of this codec is when it comes to color grading, as you should be able to adjust the image more before you start getting artifacts. And another advantage is that your editing system is usually going to have an easier time with ProRes compared to the more compressed codecs. The big downside of this codec is that it creates huge file sizes. And in my opinion, I would only use this codec if the project really demanded it. Otherwise, I just think that the inconvenience of the file size is not worth what to my eyes is only really a minimal quality improvement. In the camera app, if we swipe along from basic video mode, we get slow motion video mode. If you have an iPhone 13 model or later, you will also have cinematic mode here. Using slow-mo mode means the camera will record video at a high frame rate and then it will play it back at a slower frame rate. In this case, 30 frames per second. If your model of iPhone is capable, you will find you have two recording speeds. So back in camera settings, we can find record slow-mo, tap that to open up options. So when I have the format set to most compatible, I find here that I have three options: 1080p HD at 120 frames per second, 720p HD at 240 frames per second, and 1080p HD at 240 frames per second as well. And now the last option is going to automatically record in the high efficiency codec. But if I go back into the format settings and I switch it to high efficiency, then back in the slow motion setting, I only have two options here. So 240 frames per second slowed to 30 frames per second is going to be twice as slow, obviously, as 120 frames per second slowed to 30 frames per second. So whatever you select here, you will get when you switch to slow-mo mode in the camera app. But again, you can just switch this setting within the camera app itself, as we do in normal video mode. Personally, if I want to shoot slow motion, I will usually use the 60 frames per second option and slow to 24 or 30 frames per second. For me, the 120 and 240 frames per second options are a bit more extreme than I usually need. Plus, I do really like to have 4K video, but there are times when that very, very slow motion can be pretty effective. Now, when you play back your slow-mo video, you might notice that the slow motion effect does not start immediately.
So if you want this to start immediately, or at a different position, you need to use the edit function.
Open the video in the gallery and tap edit. Below the video you can see two timelines. The top one you will see when you edit any video, not just a slow motion one. This one allows you to trim the ends. So slide the ends to where you want the video to start and stop, and then click done. The second timeline shows you where the slow motion effect starts and where it ends. All you have to do is slide the start and end points to where you want them and then click done. You can either save as a new clip or save over the original clip. Unless you know you have the edit exactly as you want it, it's usually best to save as a new clip. And that way you get to keep the old clip in case you want to change the edit or create more than one new clip from the original clip. So this can be used to create that speed ramp style effect, where the slow motion only kicks in at a key dramatic point in the video. The final video mode within the iPhone camera app is called Time-Lapse. You can think of this like the exact opposite of slow motion. Whereas slow motion is time slowed down, time-lapse is time speeded up. Now usually a time-lapse feature allows you to choose how fast that you want to speed up time. In my Samsung, the time-lapse feature allows you to choose different speeds from 5 times faster to 45 times faster. However, the iPhone does this differently, and it's actually quite clever. As you can see, there's a record button and a camera selector, and that's it really. Basically, Apple wants to make shooting time-lapses as simple as possible, and they've made it so all you have to do is press record and let the iPhone do the thinking. And no matter how long you record for, within reason, iPhone will output a 30 frames per second video between roughly 20 and 40 seconds long. So what they've done here is to use the length of time you record for to decide how fast to speed things up. The longer you record, the more your iPhone will compress time to fit into a 20 to 40 second clip. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. For example, if you record for 5 minutes, you will get time speeded up 15 times faster than normal. If you record for 10 minutes, you will get a video going 30 times faster. I actually found this cool little online calculator which lets you see how your iPhone is calculating things. And I'll link to that in the description. If you want to record a time lapse, you will need to mount your iPhone to something steady. So a tripod is going to be best, but you could also rest your iPhone somewhere, because if you hold it in your hands, you're going to get a messy time lapse. You can get very cheap mini tripods for smartphones, which fold up very small, or you can simply add a clamp to a regular camera tripod. Another tip for time-lapse is to lock exposure before you start recording by tapping and holding on the screen until it's locked. But if you don't lock exposure, then each time the iPhone captures a new frame, it will reset exposure. So this can make your time-lapse look less smooth. Another use for this feature is to shoot hyperlapse videos. And the difference between time-lapse and hyperlapse is that with time-lapse, your camera is motionless, whereas with hyperlapse, your camera moves. Hyperlapse shots can be captured when you're walking or riding a bike, driving a car, or some other method of travel. For a walking shot, use the steady grip method that I talked about earlier, and then just move at an even, steady pace. And these shots do look more interesting if you have interesting buildings around you or people moving around. Basically you want your audience to have something to look at. As you're moving along, try to keep the camera aimed at something to stop it wobbling around too much. And if you switch the grid on, that's going to help you out there. And if you have a cool landmark, you can circle around it by keeping it in the middle of your grid as you move.
So as we've seen, you can simply tap the shutter button to take videos and photos, but it can also be used in other ways. One of those features is called Quick Take.
In photo or video mode, tap and hold the shutter button. While you're holding down the button, the camera app starts recording video. Lift your finger to stop recording. Now you might notice this padlock icon to the side of the shutter button. So if you slide across to the padlock, the camera app will continue recording video as if it was in video mode. The downside of shooting video this way is that you will always get 1080p at 30 frames per second video, and there's no option to change settings. So if you want high quality video, you will just need to switch to video mode. By now, you probably noticed that when you start recording video, a second shutter button appears. And if you tap this, it will take a photo. So this means that you can capture videos and photos at the same time. Burst mode allows you to take lots of photos one after the other very quickly. So instead of tapping the shutter, just swipe it to the side. And as long as you hold it down, it will keep taking photos. And this is good for a variety of situations like sports or events, for example. Now tap to open the photos that you just took in the Photos app. Each burst of photos is kept in one place. And at the top here it says burst, and it says how many photos that you took in that burst. Click select, and now you can browse the photos within that burst and select the ones that you want to keep. So when you have the camera app open, the volume buttons of your iPhone now act as shutter buttons. So you can use them to take photos or start and stop recording. If we go into camera settings, we can toggle on volume up for burst. Now the top volume button will start your camera app shooting photos in burst mode. Just hold down the button for as long as you want, and you can see the number tells you how many photos that you've taken.
If you have an iPhone 13 or later model, you will have the option to shoot cinematic mode.
This mode adds a fake blurry background to your image, what we might call a bokeh effect. If you've watched movies or seen professionally shot photos, you'll probably have noticed the background is very out of focus in some shots. And this is a great way to create separation between the subject and the background, especially when we want people to focus on the subject without getting distracted. So at the moment, this mode is not really 100% perfect. It does quite a good job, but you will see strange, blurry artifacts in places, especially things with lots of fine detail, like hair, for example. So this mode allows you to lock onto a subject to track them, and then it will try to keep that subject in focus. You can also lock exposure and focus like in regular video mode. You can adjust the f number, which is like a virtual aperture of the lens. And the lower the number, the bigger the aperture is trying to mimic, and therefore the blurrier the background is going to be. So you might find that you get the best results by avoiding a very blurry background. So if you just add a little bit of blur, the places where the computational effect does less well, like around hair, are going to be less obvious. But another downside of cinematic mode is that it's limited to 1080p HD and 30 frames per second.
So here's a fun trick to do with the zoom wheel. A dolly zoom is a shot which has been around in cinema for decades.
If you get it right, the subject remains the same size while the background expands or contracts. To achieve this shot, simply zoom in on the subject while you move away from the subject, or zoom out while you move towards the subject. It does take a little bit of practice to get right, but it can be a fun shot to get and use in your edits.
So everything I've talked about so far can be done with your iPhone straight out of the box. But if you really want to improve the quality of your video, you should think about buying a camera app, which is gonna give you more control. This is a video clip for a documentary that I shot using smartphones.
And this was captured in low light, and if I zoom in, you can see that there's lots of this ugly noise in the shadows. But now here's a similar clip, but this time I used an app called FiLMiC Pro. And if I zoom in, you can see that there's much less noise in the shadows. So using this app, I was able to shoot higher quality video with my iPhone for my documentary. The film is actually called Hobgoblin, the Making of a Smartphone Filmmaker. It's about a filmmaker shooting a short horror film on an iPhone 13 Pro Max. There are actually other apps with similar features to FiLMiC Pro, but I still actually prefer this one. There's well-known feature films like Tangerine, Unsane, and High Flying Bird, which have all been shot using this app. So the app gives you controls similar to those that you get using a regular camera. The one thing that's missing is aperture control, and that's because iPhones and basically all smartphones have a fixed aperture. So using FiLMiC Pro, you can set and lock your shutter speed. Shutter speed has this effect on the appearance of your video. For example, fast shutter speed makes your video look less smooth. But the problem is that even if we use an app like FiLMiC Pro, in bright conditions, we cannot reduce our shutter speed enough for smooth looking video.
So one option for getting smoother video is to shoot at 60 frames per second and play back at 60 frames per second. The problem is that video played back at 60 frames per second can seem less cinematic and a little bit more digital looking. And another issue is that 60 frames per second causes more problems in low light situations. So why can't we just switch between 60 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and 24 frames per second, depending on the light conditions? And the reason that we want to avoid this is because we will have problems when we come to edit those clips together.
And if you join my Patreon, you can download my ebooks and video lessons, which go into all this kind of stuff in more detail.
So there's another option to reduce shutter speed in bright conditions, and that is to use a thing called an ND filter.
So there's all kinds of options for adding an ND filter to your iPhone. Companies like Moment, Polar Pro, and Sandmark make various products to use with your iPhone, and I'll link to all that stuff in the description. And you can also watch my video where I list my favorite accessories for iPhone filmmaking. Apart from regular photo mode, there's two other photo modes, Portrait and Pano. In Portrait mode, you can create a fake blurry background in your photos. The app analyzes the image and tries to work out where the subject is and then blurs everything behind. Portrait mode for photos tends to look better than cinematic mode for video, and that's because it's only capturing one frame. In portrait mode, you can use the main camera, the front selfie camera, and the telephoto camera. The rear camera lens picker is now in the corner here. And in the middle, you can choose the type of portrait effect that you want to apply. Tap and hold to bring up a wheel, which you can then use to select the desired effect. If you're trying to add blurry background, but you think it looks a little bit too fake, try reducing the F number. So the F number here actually refers to the control of the size of the aperture in a regular camera. But your iPhone has a fixed aperture, so this is all done by computational methods. Tap the F in the corner and swipe here to select the amount of blur. The lower the F number, the more blur will be applied. You can also get to this by swiping away from the shutter to bring up the effects menu and then just tapping the F. So you can also adjust this F number after you have taken the photo. open the photo in the gallery, tap F and swipe as before. And now tap done. In Pano mode, you can create very wide panorama shots. And this is great for landscapes and other situations where you want to capture a wide vista. Hold your iPhone vertically, tap the shutter, and slowly pan left to right. These shots might not work so well if you have lots of moving objects within the frame. Now, if you go too fast, it's going to tell you to slow down, so keep a lookout for that. AirDrop is great for quickly sending photos and videos to other Apple devices. However, sometimes your iPhone is going to compress the media before sending it, and that's going to reduce the quality. I've noticed this mostly when sending videos that were shot with a third-party app, you know, like Insta360 or the Zune Cami app. And if you see a message saying preparing before the video is sent, then it might be compressing the video. Now, if you want to stop your iPhone doing this, there are two settings. Firstly, go into settings and then go into settings for the Photos app. And at the bottom, select keep originals. And secondly, before you actually share a video using AirDrop, tap here where it says options and then toggle on all photos data. And now your file will be sent without any kind of compression applied.
If you want to learn more about videography, or if you want to simply support this channel so I can keep making these videos, then you can join us on Patreon. And also you can chat to me about any specific projects that you're working on or any specific pieces of equipment that you want to know about. Also, I have all kinds of downloads there. There's various books on the film look, on smartphone filmmaking. So that's it for this video. Hope to see you in the next one.